Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Arin Sime, founder and CEO of WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development firm specializing in live video applications, and we're here to help take your video application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. For today's episode, I'm joined by a previous guest back with us again. Always interesting to talk with Varun Singh. Varun is the founder of callstats.io and the head of call quality and connectivity at 8x8. And today he's going to talk to us about the effect of the shelter-in-place restrictions on networking quality for video apps. So Varun, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back again, and look forward to conversing with you. So let's talk a little bit about call stats. So some big announcement. We were acquired by 8x8 in Jan 2020. So just before the shelter in place and COVID-19 took off, the global pandemic came about. We were already at that point used extensively internally within 8x8, and we'll continue to explore those options within 8x8. We're now part of the CPaaS offering that 8x8 announced earlier 2 months ago. And that means that call stats would still continue to be offered as it was before, as a standalone with Amazon Connect, Video Flex, Vonage, TalkBox, so those folks can continue using call stats. We will be part of the 8x8 voice and video APIs as they become available to developers. So I see that as a big opportunity, both within 8x8 ecosystem and WebRTC at large. And we're continuing to be bundled with existing 8x8 products. So meetings, Jitsi has had call stats for about 5-6 years now. The team with ML's done really great work since the beginning of the year. They've grown, their usage has grown tremendously, I forget, 10,000 times or something within this period. So we're being used within the meetings product. There's a pro version of that. For $10, you can get access per seat. We will get into virtual office, virtual call centers. Those are the other offerings by 8x8 in forthcoming months. We're not saying when though. So COVID-19, it's a global pandemic. It's impacted everyone's daily life. For the fact that we're doing this. Oh well, we've been doing this the webinar for a while, but a lot of these in-person conferences have turned online, which means that it's affected everyone's daily life. Initially, it was just self-distancing, people working from home, people choosing to work from home and such. But then at some point, depending on which part of the world you're in, like January, February, March, depending on what day, the countries decided to close their borders, lock down their cities, and so on and so forth. And the restrictions vary from geography to geography within the same country. So for this talk, when we started analyzing this data, so we looked at January, February, March, especially going into April. We said, okay, we should analyze this data. And end of April, we basically collected all the data and put it together. And we started seeing trends in May. And one of the things we noticed is that we could do a whole series on this, because the impact globally is different, because the days when people went, the shelter in place came, it kind of varies how the user behavior changed because of that. So for this talk, we're basically looking at North America, basically USA, Canada, Mexico. And that's mainly because US is the major focus. Canada and Mexico is they have significant volume, but not enough. USA covers quite a lot of that. And their use cases are similar, time zones are similar. So they work in the same kind of period of time. So it's very easy to analyze this data. For this analysis, we also basically look at calls that originate and terminate in this region. So not pan global, because that would just mix everything up. The other thing is audio is Opus, video is VP8 or 9. We do not do G711 just because the call center has been impacted vastly, and we think that would be a different conversation in itself. So what we're doing here is basically audio video communication for team collaboration or healthcare, education, or any other use case but call centers. And it covers products that are self-hosted or on a CPaaS, either on a third-party CPaaS or 8x8. And one of the things that we do is we do not include any of the new customers that joined CallStats during or after the pandemic hit. So this is basically for the data from customers which were with us on January, February, March, and April. So it is the 4 months. None of the new customers are showing, like we're not introduced that data because it's very hard to like compare contrast because the usage is completely different for the new customers. And we really do not know how it impacts their business and our numbers because the skew would definitely be towards the newer number, like the shelter in place numbers. So going with US, and we use US specifically because actually I was in the US from Feb 29 to March 14. So I was in the Bay Area, like working with the team in the US because we got acquired in January. They were moving offices and stuff like that. So we basically waited until they got a brand new spanking new office, and we're like, yeah, we'll come there. We went there. And while I was there, we could see like folks starting to work from home, even at 8x8, of course, across Bay Area. And we also, when I flew out of the US, it was literally like the last few days before the flights were already being stopped. So they'd already said the flights are going to be closed, and they were like 3-4 days before the flights would come to a halt. And the other thing is that we know, like by sequence of events, it's very easy to like talk about the US because like this map shows that there's a wide amount of data to know when, which cities, which areas went into like shelter at home. And if you look at the data vis-a-vis these locations, we can easily do an analysis of it, which is why we're basing this on the US alone at the moment, or North America. So we can see like towards the end of March, things like all states, I wouldn't say all, like a lot of the states kind of locked down in some form or the other. So for our data analysis, we basically looked at it in 4 parts. One was pre-shelter, that's Jan to Feb. So 1st of Jan to 29th of Feb. Traveling from work from home, because a lot of companies like Amazons and Googles went into like rolling people at different locations to work from home, and that was between March 1 to 15th. It depends on which companies, what locations. So we just bundle it together. Then there was a transition in shelter in place, like California went early, then other states followed suit. And we noticed that these two things could not be put together because we'll come to the next slide, where it shows that traveling work from home to transitioning to shelter in place was slightly different. And I'll talk to it in the next slide. And then shelter in place, which is March 28th onwards, till the end of April, which is what this whole thing covers. So the first 4 months of the year. And the reason I said like this is different because we can see that the usage of audio and video, and like for example, we can see audio video usage or only audio usage was really high in the period of, like before shelter in place. Then there was this trialing where people were working on from home. So there was a flip back where there was more video for that period. And during the shelter, like just when the shelter in place orders came in, so towards the end of March, we see that also the usage varied a lot. So we see people moving back to audio. And one thing that when we were talking around within the company and it was talking to folks, so this is very anecdotal, it seems that a lot of people, because they were transitioning, they were moving equipment back for their home office or getting things in place to make sure that they were equipped for shelter in place. A lot of the people were doing other stuff in general, in addition to what they were doing before. So they flipped back to just doing audio as they were before. And once the shelter in place was like cemented in place, and we can see that video and audio conversations kind of equalize. So there are equal number of people doing audio video, whereas there are like the same number that is doing audio only. which is starkly in contrast to, like, if you compare 1 and 4, we can see that audio only calls have like dropped significantly compared to compared to audio and video. And there are many use cases. Like we see that, like on our own systems, we see that people join the calls for video through their desktop, but also dial in through the audio. So if someone's screen sharing or something, they can look at the big screen, and their audio still goes through their own channel through mobile or something, so that they can quickly go from one meeting to the other and only use the video if it's needed for the call. So there's a lot of emergent use cases that we see, which is different from what we saw before, where people were mainly doing audio only. The other thing we see is the length of usage. So this is in minutes, and you can see that like the usage overall compared 1 to 4 has increased, and we all know that we're doing a lot more video calls. A lot of them are slightly longer than before. Typically, you don't do like short calls anymore. Either you do very many short calls, or you do like one long call where a lot of people get together, have a discussion, and leave when the discussion's over, or continue having discussions in smaller groups. So you can see that 1 and 4, there's a big change, and the 2 and 3 is explained by the fact that when people suddenly were transitioning, some people were working remote, some people were working from office. There were longer calls during that period. Then, as people were transitioning to shelter and home, they were doing other things to get ready. So we can see that there was a dip during that period when people were moving to shelter in place, and then as shelter in place became cemented, we have that new situation where the calls are longer. So we'll quickly switch to like talking about network call quality, right? Because that's what everyone's interested in. Like, usage is interesting. We know anecdotally like how things have changed, because we can just reflect on our own usage behavior, and kind of the results show what we think in general is happening over. But impact on networks, we know that another anecdotal thing is that before shelter in place, or the first few days in shelter in place, things were bad, and then things improved dramatically. Either ISPs opening up, or systems or products scaling. Using that time to scale very quickly, broadly. The auto scalings changed dramatically from what they had before. Like, if their peaks were narrower, now their peaks were wider. So a lot of people had to like re-optimize their spending in a way once they realized that they would be spending more, so that you can't have like auto scaling on demand. They had to scale to higher numbers. So here, like for example, we can see that in this period between Jan to March, we can easily see the impact on weekends. Like, it drops because the load on the system in general overall is lower, so the numbers become better, and then during the week they escalate, and then they kind of go up and down. But over since March, you can see that kind of sinusoidal diurnality or weekly cadence is kind of lost. It's like the latencies are higher overall. You can see that it's not that much. Like this area here in the like the gray area, if you look at, that's 25 to 75 percentile. That varies a lot. That the variance has reduced, so there's a slightly larger spread, and the spread is sustained in some sense. So latency and overall the numbers are not bad, right? So like we're looking at 150 milliseconds in the US for most audio video calls. This is okay, and this is the 75 percentile shows that's about 150 milliseconds. There are definitely cases where it's higher, 25%, but it's not too bad. 75% of the calls are okay. But latency is only one part of the story. Jitter is the other, right? So jitter means that when you're speaking, latency means that you can hear people slightly delayed. But jitter means that you get garbled audio, you get robotics sounds, you get other manifestation, Donald Duck type of speaking, because packets get, because of the delay or because of the stress on the network, there's jitter, which delays audio, and then when you play them back, you're either accelerating playback or you're decelerating or playing back slowly, which causes the audio to get garbled. we can see that there's this marked difference between like March like Jan to March to April. We can see the jitters higher, although it's not like if we look at the 75 percentile, it's actually going up to all the way to 30 milliseconds, 25 milliseconds. And the packetization for audio is 20 milliseconds. So the packets are delayed by one packet, right? So like that's the amount of like jitter that we've introduced. And if you look at the previous area, it's like 5 milliseconds. That's like 5 to 25 means like we need to work a little bit on our like queuing, and if you have a good playout buffer, you might have to change your algorithms for the playout buffer. Jitter is one aspect. The other aspect is packet loss, right? So like jitter means packets are delayed and then they're played back. But if there's too much queuing in the network, you would see packet loss. So this is the case where the audio becomes choppy, you cuts and blanks. What it results in typically is you having to repeat yourself, right? Because you say something, people don't hear you on the other side or hear parts of it and say like, can you repeat? You end up doing that. Overall, we see that jitter increased because queuing was there, and we can also say that there's much more packet loss compared to before. And this is 95 percentile jitter or 95 percentile packet loss. Sorry for that. And even that is not that much. Like it's within 0.5% of the cases. So in most cases, 95% of the call has less than this packet loss. So it still doesn't look really that bad. So overall, if I look at all of this, it seems like there's some jitter, there's some delay increase, but it's not horrendous at the moment. Jitter is the only thing that you're caring about, and there's packet loss. So if you have FEC or something to like go around these problems, it's easy. So some configuration of the media pipeline can definitely be helped, but you don't have to re-engineer your system. And most people also want to know what's the audio throughput. And if you look at this, like before March or like between Jan to Feb, we see like this kind of behavior which is sinusoidal. But since March, since mid-February, basically like the behavior is kind of very constant for both audio and video. Like we don't see much change in throughput. This is the aggregate throughput for input and output per media stream that you're receiving. So if you're an SFU where you have one person in big video and then the small ones, this is taking into account the big one. If you're doing the tile view, then they're all the small ones. So it's the aggregate of what you're sending and receiving. And in this case, again, we don't see that much difference. So like the big difference, if you look at North America in total, is that, okay, there's slightly higher jitter. And so we said, okay, this none of this looks really bad. So let's just look at the US specifically. So we looked at Bay Area, like like a lot of the startups are there, a lot of the products that are launching are there, a lot of the products run out of there, including 8x8. So we said, let's just look at Bay Area, like what's happening within the Bay Area, because a lot of people were at work, right? So so the usage has actually tremendously increased in video for the people in Bay Area, because earlier they were just doing short calls or just dialing into like work remotely. Like for those people who were working remotely, they were doing the same thing as before. But a lot of people went from working in office to working from home. So we said, okay, let's look at Bay Area. And impact on latency, we can see like especially with during the early March when people were experimenting and the ISPs did not know the shelter-in-place is going to come in, we can see that there was a big spike in latency, which as soon as shelter-in-place and people knew that there was testing, so ISPs responded very quickly, it seems like. They were caught unawares in the beginning, but they knew that what is going to come in the forthcoming days, and they responded fairly quickly. And we can see that the spike is the first week going into the second week, and they start to respond before the end of second week, which is heartening. Like the same thing with jitter. We can see like the jitter in the first half of March when people were experimenting with working from home, moving completely to working from home. We can see audio jitter was through the roof. Like we don't even plot it here, right? Like the 75 percentile is so high that like things were like really bad for quite a few people. But as we go into April, shelter in home, and like the new like cementing the shelter in place, we can see that the audio jitter comes down dramatically. And this is slightly different. If you remember what we saw before, for the 75 percentile was around 30 for North America total, but Bay Area specifically, like, it's much higher than what it was for the baseline or benchmark for the US. That being said, let's look at West and East Coast. So we'll come back to all this because what's interesting is Bay Area specifically we looked at because we know for a fact that a lot of people changed behavior, had to move. Then we said, okay, East Coast is where we see a lot of problems, right? Like the cases are higher, people are significantly constrained in their movements. And we said, okay, let's compare West and East Coast. And West Coast went into lockdown much earlier. Like California was already kind of in lockdown by the time I left, partly because the companies had already decided to work from home. So left and right. So the thing that you see here is West Coast, East Coast. So just like you see it on the map. So the left one, you can see that the experiments are more pronounced. The RTT variation is more pronounced in the beginning of March compared to on the other side. We can also see that the variation, although over time kind of peters out, like they're both very like similar in behavior, but there is a little bit more noise within the West Coast area, especially in the beginning when before the transitioning to shelter in place. What I found exciting or interesting was the jitter numbers, and you can see here like the ISP's response, or like let's say the experimentation from like anecdotally or maybe from what we can see from the data is that the West Coast was hit more uh, by the shelter in place or like the experimentation, because I think a lot more people suddenly went to work from home remotely in that period in early March, resulting in like more load on the network. And what is given the East Coast is lower, it also seems like it's more an ISP issue than like scaling, because if there was scaling, we would have seen the numbers on the left side on the RTT actually jump higher, because if they start hitting the East Coast servers as opposed to West Coast servers, we don't see that much. Like we just see like there is load on the network, the RTTs are slightly higher. More or less people might be like shuffling between East and West Coast servers, but uh, but it's not that pronounced compared to the jitter. The jitter is more pronounced on the West Coast, which seems like was more like an ISP issue than like a load on the servers. Although it cannot be discounted overall. And so that comes to so just want to close up the talk because we have about 8 minutes. So overall, what we're saying is observations are usage is increased, which we know because we're all on more calls. So that's not groundbreaking. We know that that's the case. We noticed that the average minutes are higher compared to before. We do notice that the ISPs and products were put under stress when let's say enterprises experimented with remote work before shelter in place, and that's really pronounced from the results that we see. And things actually become stable as we go into like cementing the shelter in place. So like as people realize that this is going to be the situation, like either more capacity was allocated on those ISPs, some of the and I think even products made a hard choice. Like some of them like stopped doing 4K HD. Like everyone kind of went down. Some people went down to 720p. Some people went down to 480p in video resolutions to like alleviate some of the stress on the networks. And some of it could also be the YouTube traffic, Netflix traffic is also downgraded what they were consuming in terms of quality. So the impact on our WebRTC vis-a-vis like behavior has also been less pronounced. Let's say like if people continue to do 4K streaming while like trying to do like high quality video calls, things would have been worse. So I think overall we've seen like people like realize what the new situation would be, kind of take a step back and look at what the global impact would be, and scale back resolutions on like video streaming. Also, products on WebRTC kind of scaled their behavior to match that, and a lot of people scaled, product scaled, the ISP scaled. So things are not as bad as one would imagine. And I think in summary, I would say both the distributed network, or like the fact that the internet was created to be tolerant to behavior change, and the individual parts of it have kind of people have made local optimizations which have resulted in a better outcome for a lot of us. So with that, I'll leave 5 minutes for questions.
Thanks a lot, Varun. So yeah, that's really interesting. It's interesting to see such distinct changes in behavior through the 4 phases. I like how you could draw that out. I personally had only been thinking of it as a flipping a switch, a transition of one stage to a second stage, and those intermediate stages are very interesting with the initial spike, and then a big drop after all of them in each pattern. It's really comforting to know that overall the internet has held up, right? That's the great news about this. I mean, even with the some of the distinct spikes that you saw, the scale of them overall is not that bad. So the technology, everything from the network level to WebRTC itself, pretty well designed. I mean, this was quite the global stress test, to put it there for sure. No one planned for that.
Exactly. Yeah, and I was actually, like, when we were looking through the data, it becomes very noisy, and we had to split up geographies and dates, and that's why the 4 phases, and that's why it's only the US, because we've literally had to do the same thing for Europe, where the Mediterraneans with the Italians and Italy going into, like, getting the brunt of it actually really early on. So the way their behavior, like, you can't bundle EU together or Europe together and say, like, we'll do this analysis. You have to, like, look at it very geographically. And US overall seemed like a more sensible choice, because, like, the East West Coast, Bay Area, North America in totality kind of made sense. But like, when we look at all the other data, that's we would have to, like, push the timelines for everyone, like, because shelter and homes are different. And I think glad you brought up the 4 phases, because we want to, like, set up this 4 phases now, and then as we do more of this analysis, we want to go back and see if these 4 phases are as pronounced for each of those geographies that we go and look at independently in the future.
Yeah, that'll definitely be interesting. So I want to, we just have a little bit of time left, but there's a lot that we could talk about in more detail about the trends, and you talked about some best practices that we could start to think about in our WebRTC applications, of being able to scale back resolution, if we hit another period like this, for example. Are there any, it seems overall the technology has responded well. Do you think that there are going to be any major changes to how, like, queuing packets, I think you mentioned, as an example of anything that would change as a result of this?
I can see, like, people wanting more control, and I think that desire for more fine-grained control has been like demanded, let's say, in the last 4 or 5 years, and the APIs are moving in that direction. But I think this would accelerate that demand, and, like, breaking down the WebRTC 1.0 into like it's a sum of all parts now, but, like, breaking down those components so that they can feed into each other, where some people may want to like, replace the existing technology with a new bit. And I think this WASM or WebAssembly or those things will become more exciting uses, because, like, the basic thing works. So the question is, like, depending on your use case, you may want to go back and, like, look at which parts of the system you want to tweak. Specifically in certain circumstances, you might want to use default most of the time until you realize that you're getting more queuing, and make some concessions.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. If I think about that, kind of the high-level trends in WebRTC as a technology and development of WebRTC applications, like what you just said makes me think, that we're moving into a third phase here, right? I think a WebRTC development a couple of years ago as being all about compatibility, right? That was the first thing that people always talked about. Is it compatible in every browser, right? And then now that it is, the conversation was more about performance. And so things like call stats come into play, and being able to do better analytics around the calls and the connections themselves. And now, obviously, all of that is still important, but moving into a phase where we want to be able to not just see that, but control it more and control it on the fly is an interesting observation, especially as more business processes, adapt to this. At some point, hopefully shelter in place, it goes away permanently. There's probably going to be a lot of ups and downs in a longer time period than any of us want until that happens. But a lot of these business processes are going to stay virtual. And so being able to not just see the data around how it's performing, but also be able to control and directly impact that through the application and on the fly, whether that's done automatically with AI or through user settings, some combination of both, I imagine. So
Exactly.
I think that's a really interesting observation.
Yeah, and we'll probably do another analysis later in fall when we see the shelter in place be lifted, let's say, and see how much of this actually goes back to Jan Feb, right? What is the new normal vis-a-vis the Jan Feb area, which would be a good benchmark. So we'll have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you would have going either there's a fifth phase, which is slowly going back to normal, or remaining in place because people are a bit more conservative with going back to the way it was. And we can see that a lot of companies have already announced that they'll continue to do remote work for the rest of the year. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that makes me also, one of the things in some of the quality reports that you've released previously through call stats, it's always interesting to me is seeing the percentage of video calls that require turn traffic.
Yeah.
Have you seen any change, any impact on that as people shift out of the enterprise network and into home networks?
Right. Actually, that was one thing that we kind of skipped here, so that you go and read the report when we do actually announce it. But a good catch, a good question to ask. And I would say yes, the usage has changed. And some of it is different than what we would have hoped. Home networks are not as bad as corporate networks. So in a lot of cases, yeah, you don't really need turn TCP is not as used as often as it would be in enterprise networks, but there is turn usage is higher. And a lot of the apps do things, right? If you're already in an SFU, then you need a turn or not, and using turn to hide geographies and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things at play. And when we looked at our numbers, we saw we can easily see that there's a big jump in usage, but some of it is generally, a lot of it is also people using turn initially to set up calls faster, because you get the allocation and then moving them back to peer-to-peer or non-turn if needed. So that they can actually reduce the load on their turn servers, but still give you the connectivity response that you need, setting it up quickly, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So before we close, I would like to thank Nate who did all the analysis for us at 8x8. So thank you, Nate, and we and the 8x8 team, because a lot of people came together to get this done. So definitely a shout out to them, especially the call stats team at 8x8.
Excellent. Yeah, and we look forward to the continued analysis of this in other regions and over time as well. This is really interesting, Varun. Appreciate it. Any other announcements that you want to make around upcoming events, webinars, or anything from call stats or 8x8 to look out for?
I think there are definitely you should definitely keep in touch with 8x8s on Twitter, for example. There's a lot more happening. ML is pushing really hard with Meetings Pro, so keeping an eye out. If you've not had the chance to talk to him, I definitely recommend getting him on. He has exciting stories to share, which I think would be great. And the ecosystem around Jitsi has grown tremendously. So I'm really excited about what we're doing.
Excellent. Good. Well, really appreciate it. Thanks again for joining us, Varun.
Thank you very much.
We'll be posting this episode in a couple of days to WebRTC Ventures and YouTube, so you can watch the recorded version. I also want to encourage any of our viewers to check out rtc-conference.com, which is where we are starting to accept talk submissions for the Illinois Institute of Tech Real-Time Communications Conference. It's a conference that's typically been held in Chicago in October every year, and we've had a lot of great speakers at it over the years, including Varun. And this year we'll be going all virtual and also making it free to attendees. So really looking forward to bringing that to a wider audience, and you can go there to submit a talk proposal and also look out for the conference agenda to be announced and join us online in October for that. So that's rtc-conference.com. And if you want to keep up with upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live, you can join our email list at WebRTC.ventures or follow us here on BigMarker and social media. So thanks again to everyone for joining. Thank you to Varun. And let's take it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.